In 2016, I bought a Cessna 182 that completely changed my life. Now before this, I was renting Cessna 172s, but there was a moment where it became really clear to me that it was time to stop renting and start owning. For me, I found that you could boil it down to a three-part decision: freedom, frequency, and finances, all F's, easy to remember. I think buying versus renting can be a complicated decision, but for me, when you just boil it down to these three categories, it started to make a lot more sense. The first category is freedom. A freedom just means, do I have the freedom I'm looking for in aviation? Now, in some rental and club situations, it might be challenging to take the airplane for a full weekend or an overnight trip, the really fun stuff. Whereas in ownership, you obviously have all the freedom you could want because you own the thing and you can fly it when and wherever you want. Now, some rental and club scenarios have great access to airplanes and freedom isn't an issue. And if that's your situation, that is awesome. That is probably worth staying in. I was renting by the hour and I had very little freedom. Really, the main time that the airplane was available was like Tuesday nights at 8 p.m. So I have a lot of sunsets in my logbook, but I didn't have very much freedom at all. So the questions to ask are, do I have the amount of flying freedom I would like in a renting situation? Or am I maxed out and the only way to unlock more freedom is by owning the airplane? For me, I wanted longer rental blocks so I could do weekend trips and have some spontaneity, not just flying Tuesday nights, in the dark. So the verdict for me on freedom eventually was own. In case you're wondering about ownership clubs, since you don't have total ownership or complete unrestricted, unlimited access to the airplane, I'm gonna reference clubs in the same boat as renting for the purpose of this video. Second is frequency. Basically, how often are you able to fly, and does your rental situation allow you to have the spontaneity that you want? If you're in a rental situation where you're flying about as frequently as you want or need, renting can be a really great thing, don't get me wrong. But when I rented, I had to think pretty far ahead. I wasn't really able to say, man, the weather looks great tomorrow, let's go flying. I really couldn't do that much, if ever. But when you own, frequency gets solved because you have unlimited, unrestricted access to the airplane. It's awesome. You don't have to think ahead and reserve the airplane before someone else does. So the questions to ask here are this: am I able to fly as much as I realistically want to in renting? Basically, for the most part, am I able to fly when I want? When I was renting like 3 to 6 hours per month, but I really wanted to fly like 10 or more per month, but it was really hard to do so in a rental situation. So for me, eventually the verdict on frequency was own. Next is finances. Now, usually the first two, freedom and frequency, totally favor owning versus renting most of the time. It's the finances that are the sticking point. It's expensive to fly. Finances can be a little tricky because you have to look at it more than one way. You can't just look at the hourly cost of renting versus buying. That's definitely part of it, an important part of it. But you also have to look at the all-in cost for the entire year of how much you're wanting to spend on aviation. So let me explain. So first is comparing the hourly rate of renting versus buying. So when you're renting, the hourly rate usually stays the same whether you fly a little or you fly a lot. Sometimes you can get discounts for buying bulk hours or something like that, but let's ignore that for the purposes of this video. The challenge with the hourly rate is that you get a bill on your credit card after every flight, and it's not hard to say, was that sunset worth $500? And in those moments in particular, you really wish you just owned the airplane so you didn't get a credit card bill at the end. So you might want to bring your hourly cost down. You can certainly do that with owning, but there's a little math involved to figure it out. When you own, you have fixed costs you have to pay for regardless of how much you fly: insurance, hangar, annual inspection, etc. Then you have variable costs like fuel that you only pay for anytime the engine is running. So if you only fly a little bit that year, your effective hourly cost is a lot higher than if you flew a lot that year. For an easy example, let's assume you had $10,000 of fixed costs for the year and your variable costs per hour were $50. I'm making this up. If you only flew for 1 hour that year, your effective hourly cost would be $10,050 just to fly that 1 hour. But if you flew for 100 hours that year, you still have $10,000 of fixed costs. And now you have $5,000, I'm doing math on the fly here, of variable costs. So your effective hourly rate would be $150 per hour. So you can see the more you fly, the more that your hourly rate comes down. It's kind of one of those, hate to say it, the more you spend, the more you save type things, which I hate that argument because yeah, you're spending a lot more, which we'll cover here in just a second. But now that you know your hourly costs of owning, you can compare those to renting. And so if your hourly costs of owning are the same or less than renting, then it's a pretty clear winner. But if your effective hourly costs of owning are still higher than renting at your projected number of flight hours per year, then you just need to decide if that premium, that extra, is worth it to you to get all of the freedom and frequency you could want. In other words, yeah, maybe it's $200 a year to own versus $180 to rent. I'm making that up, but it's more expensive, but it's totally worth it for me because that extra 20 bucks an hour means I get complete unrestricted access to the airplane. That's worth it. You'll have to decide that for yourself. So that's one way to look at the finances. And the second is just as important. It's comparing the total dollars that you spent in a year. In renting, your money spent varies directly with the number of hours flown. The more you fly, the more that you pay. When you own, you have fixed costs like your hangar, insurance, annual inspection, etc., that you incur even if the airplane doesn't fly at all that year. So before you even fly, you've already racked up some expenses. But your variable costs like fuel are probably a lot less than the cost of renting. So what happens is eventually your costs will intersect at a certain number of hours flown and money spent for that year. And that makes it easy to show when it's the same or cheaper to own. But the question to ask here is this: is it realistic to spend that much in the first place to even achieve that break even? So in other words, if that break even happens at say $20,000 spent for the year, but you planned on only spending $10,000 per year, then you might want to rent, even though it's still more expensive than owning on an hourly basis because your total amount spent is less and more within your budget. So the questions to ask here are this: would owning be similar in price or maybe even less versus renting? Or is the extra expense worth it for the freedom and frequency? Or based on how much I fly, is owning prohibitively expensive versus renting? So for me, while I really didn't like the hourly expense of renting, I hated getting credit card bills at the end of sunset flights. I also couldn't afford the all-in annual costs of owning an airplane just yet. I just couldn't do it. And so I kept renting, kept saving until I was in a different financial situation where I could afford the annual expense. And so I think that brings up an important point here, is that everybody's financial situation is going to be different. If you take two people evaluating the exact same rent versus buy math, but their own personal financial circumstances are night and day different, yeah, they're probably gonna come to different conclusions.
Our pets' heads are falling off!
So financially, I can't sit here and say when you should buy versus rent. It's really gonna be different for everybody. However, here is my rationale for the finances of aviation. You should come up with your own stance on it, but in case it's helpful, here's mine. It's really simple, it's 2 points. Rule number 1 is this: live within your means. Spend less than you make. That way, if you make a little or you make a lot, you'll never be upside down financially. Rule number 2 is to intentionally decide where your surplus time, energy, effort, resources, etc. will be dedicated based on what's important in your life. You need to come up with a plan on how and why you'll spend your time and your money. Now, everyone's gonna have a different take on number 2 here. For some people, they'll never get guac at Chipotle because it's $1.95 extra, and they think, what would that be worth in 50 years if I invested in stuff? And that's great. Not casting shade on you for doing that. That's awesome. That's not how I wanna live my life. I'd rather eat the guac. But I also don't spend all of my money on aviation, not just trying to spend frivolously. And so you really have to come up with a balance and understand what am I spending and why. And if you can fit aviation in number 2, rule number 2, while also not breaking rule number 1, then for me, you've got a green light to spend on aviation. If and when all 3 lights blink green for freedom, frequency, and finances, I think there's a solid argument for owning. Now, if you'd like a free financial model that helps with this buy versus rent math, I really encourage you to watch the video on the screen. It's a full webinar that I put together that talks about every step of the airplane buying process. And part of that talks about this financial model, and I give it to you for free, and there's some other resources in there you don't want to miss if you're serious about owning an airplane. So I'll see you in that video.